The industrial-strength bleach burned Maria Santos's nostrils as she scrubbed dried ketchup from the mess hall tables at Camp Pendleton, her movements mechanical after 18 months of the same routine. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the empty dining facility that would soon fill with Marines, grabbing quick breakfasts before their training exercises. She pushed a strand of dark hair from her face with the back of her rubber glove, leaving a faint streak of cleaning solution across her temple. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The sleeve of her oversized custodial uniform had ridden up as she reached across the table, exposing the intricate purple and gold tattoo that wrapped around her left forearm. She didn't notice at first, hadn't noticed for months how carefully she'd trained herself to keep that particular piece of her past hidden beneath long sleeves and careful positioning. Tattoo was a work of art, a Purple Heart medal surrounded by names and dates from her time in the 82nd Airborne. "Excuse me." The voice behind her was crisp, authoritative, and entirely unexpected. Maria's heart hammered against her ribs as she spun around, instinctively tugging her sleeve down. But it was too late. Colonel James Mitchell stood 3 feet away, his weathered face bearing the kind of expression she'd seen countless times in the Army, the look of a career officer trying to process something that didn't fit his understanding of the world. His steel-gray eyes weren't looking at her face. They were fixed on her forearm, where despite her desperate attempt to cover it, the edge of the Purple Heart was still visible beneath the bunched fabric of her uniform sleeve. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice softer now but still carrying the weight of command that had defined 32 years of military service. "That tattoo on your arm, is that what I think it is?" Maria's mouth went dry. In 18 months of cleaning this mess hall, scrubbing floors in the barracks, and emptying trash cans across the base, not a single Marine had looked at her long enough to notice anything about her except her efficiency with a mop bucket. She was invisible labor, part of the background of military life that career soldiers learned not to see. Civilian contractors were furniture, barely registering as human beings to most service members. But this colonel, she could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. The way his posture shifted from casual curiosity to something approaching respect, or maybe confusion. She couldn't tell which would be worse. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, falling back on the ingrained responses that had kept her safe in this new life. "I was just finishing up this section. I can move to another area if Staff Sergeant Santos." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her real rank, spoken aloud for the first time in almost 2 years. Maria felt the carefully constructed walls of her new identity. Maria the cleaning lady. Maria the invisible contractor. Maria who had never held a rifle or led soldiers through enemy fire crumble around her feet. Colonel Mitchell stepped closer, his eyes now taking in details she'd worked so hard to hide. The way she stood at parade rest without thinking about it. The precise edges of her haircut that she maintained out of habit. The small scar above her left eyebrow from shrapnel that no amount of makeup could completely conceal. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and Maria had never heard blasphemy sound so much like a prayer. "Your Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, 82nd Airborne. You saved 12 soldiers in that convoy ambush outside Kandahar. They gave you the Purple Heart and recommended you for the Distinguished Service Cross." The mop slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the empty mess hall like a gunshot. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more compelling military stories. Your support helps us continue creating quality content. Maria stared at Colonel Mitchell, her mind racing through a dozen different escape routes and twice as many lies she could tell. But something in his eyes, not pity, not judgment, just a soldier recognizing another soldier, made her shoulders straighten despite herself. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," she said, but the words came out wrong, carrying too much military bearing, too much authority for a woman who was supposed to be nothing more than a custodial contractor. Colonel Mitchell glanced around the empty mess hall, then back at her. "At ease, Staff Sergeant. No one else needs to hear this conversation." The familiar command triggered responses she'd spent months suppressing. Her feet shifted automatically to shoulder width apart, hands clasped behind her back. The movement was so ingrained, so natural, that she didn't realize she'd done it until she saw the colonel's slight nod of satisfaction. "How long have you been working here, Santos?" 8 months, sir." The truth slipped out before she could stop it. "And before that?" Maria's jaw tightened. This was the question that ended everything. The job, the anonymity, the carefully constructed peace she'd built for herself in the shadows of the military world she'd once lived for. "I was between positions, sir." Colonel Mitchell studied her for a long moment. At 54, he'd seen enough broken soldiers to recognize the signs. The way she held herself just slightly apart from the world. The hypervigilance that made her aware of every entrance and exit in any room she entered. The careful control in her voice that spoke of someone who'd learned not to let emotions show. "The news report said you disappeared from Walter Reed," he said quietly. "Just walked out of the psychiatric ward one night and never came back. Your family filed a missing persons report. The Army's been looking for you. The Army doesn't want me anymore." The bitterness in her voice surprised them both. "That's where you're wrong, Staff Sergeant." Maria bent to retrieve her mop, using the movement to break eye contact. "I'm just Maria now. Maria who cleans floors and empties trash and doesn't matter to anyone. That's what I wanted. Is it, though?" The question hung in the air between them. Colonel Mitchell had spent 3 decades learning to read people, and everything about Maria Santos screamed of a soldier, trying to disappear into civilian life but unable to completely shed the identity that had defined her for 12 years. Of active service. "You know what I see when I look at you," he continued. "I see someone who still shines her boots every morning even though no one will ever inspect them. Someone who makes her bunk with hospital corners out of habit. Someone who chose to work on a military base instead of anywhere else because this is the only world that makes sense to her anymore." Maria's hands tightened on the mop handle. "You don't know anything about me. I know you saved 12 lives in that convoy. I know you took shrapnel to the chest and kept fighting until every one of your soldiers was accounted for. Know you carried Private Mitchell 300 meters through enemy fire to the extraction point, even though you were bleeding out from your wounds." "Stop." The word came out sharp, commanding every inch the staff sergeant she'd once been. "I know you blame yourself for the 4 who didn't make it home." I said stop. Maria's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of the emotion she'd kept locked away for almost 2 years. Colonel Mitchell held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Okay, but Maria, and I'll call you Maria if that's what you need. To know that there are people who've been looking for you. Not to drag you back if you don't want to come, but to make sure you're okay." "Who?" "Captain Rodriguez, for one. He's been calling every VA hospital from here to Virginia, trying to track you down." Maria's breath caught. Diego Rodriguez had been her closest friend in the Army, the one person who'd understood what it meant to come from nothing and build a life in the military. He'd visited her every day at Walter Reed, bringing terrible hospital coffee and updates from their unit, trying to keep her connected to the world she was slowly retreating from. "He's stationed here now," Colonel Mitchell continued. "Has been for 6 months. If he knew you were less than a mile away, scrubbing floors in the mess hall he eats in every morning, ... He can't know." The panic in her voice was unmistakable. "Now, please, sir, I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready for any of this." Colonel Mitchell studied her for another long moment, weighing his options and his responsibilities. As a Marine officer, He had clear protocols for situations involving missing military personnel. But as a man who'd seen too many good soldiers, broken by wars that never really ended, he had other considerations. What happened to you, Santos? And I don't mean in Kandahar, I mean after. What happened that made a decorated staff sergeant disappear into a civilian cleaning job? Maria looked around the mess hall at the tables she'd scrubbed countless times, the floors she'd mopped until they gleamed, the windows she'd cleaned until they were invisible. This place had become her sanctuary, her penance, her prison. She'd chosen work that let her serve the military community while remaining completely separate from it. I couldn't sleep, she said finally. Couldn't stop seeing their faces, the 4 who didn't make it. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that convoy, making the same decisions, wondering if I could have done something different. Survivors. Guilt, that's what the doctors called it. But it wasn't guilt, it was knowledge. I knew things I shouldn't know. Like what Private Martinez looked like with half his face gone. Or how Corporal Johnson sounded when he was dying and calling for his mother. Her voice was steady now, clinical. The doctors wanted to medicate it away, talk it away, process it until it became manageable. But you didn't want it to be manageable. Maria nodded. Those 4 soldiers deserved to be remembered. All of them. Not just as names on a memorial wall, but as the weight I carry every day. The doctors said that was unhealthy thinking. That I needed to learn to forgive myself and move on. So you ran. I walked out of that hospital, and I kept walking until I found a place where I could remember them every day without anyone trying to fix me. She gestured around the mess hall. This isn't about guilt, Colonel. It's about honor. Those boys died under my command, and I'm going to carry that responsibility for the rest of my life. Colonel Mitchell felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of the kind of soldier he'd served alongside for over 3 decades. The kind who took responsibility seriously, sometimes too seriously, and who would rather shoulder impossible burdens than risk failing the people under their command. You know what I think, Staff Sergeant? I think you've been carrying this alone for too long. And I think hiding in this mess hall isn't honoring those soldiers. It's wasting the life they died protecting. Maria's eyes flashed with anger. You don't get to tell me how to honor my dead. No, I don't. But I can tell you what I see every morning when I walk through this base. I see Marines and soldiers who could learn something from someone who's been where you've been. I see young officers who need to understand what real leadership looks like under fire. I see a military community that's missing one of its own. I'm not missing, I'm right here. Are you, though? Or are you hiding behind a mop and a minimum wage job, pretending that service and sacrifice don't matter anymore? The words hit harder than Maria expected. She'd built her new life around the idea that she was still serving, just differently. Keeping the base clean was contribution. Staying invisible was safety. Not causing trouble was enough, but Colonel Mitchell's challenge forced her to confront a truth she'd been avoiding. She wasn't serving anyone by hiding. She was just existing, day after day, in a purgatory of her own making. What do you want from me, sir? Nothing. But I want to make you an offer. Maria waited, her soldier's instincts telling her that whatever came next would change everything. I run a program here for junior officers' leadership development, tactical decision-making, that sort of thing. We bring in experienced NCOs too. Share real-world scenarios and help these young Marines understand what command actually means in combat situations. I'm not qualified to teach anyone anything. Staff Sergeant, you made split-second decisions under enemy fire that saved 12 lives. You kept your unit together and fighting effective while taking casualties and running low on ammunition. You carried wounded soldiers to safety while bleeding from your own injuries. If that doesn't qualify you to teach leadership and tactical decision-making, I don't know what does. Maria felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. The idea of sharing her experiences, of turning the worst day of her military career into something that might help other soldiers survive similar situations, was both terrifying and appealing. I'm not ready to be Staff Sergeant Santos again. Then, don't be Maria Santos, guest lecturer, civilian contractor with relevant military experience. You keep your anonymity, your distance, your control over how much or how little you share. But you stop wasting what you learned in that convoy. The offer hung between them like a bridge across a chasm Maria hadn't realized she wanted to cross. But Colonel Mitchell's words had awakened something she'd thought was dead, the part of her that had always wanted to make a difference. I need time to think about it. Take all the time you need, but Maria? Colonel Mitchell's voice softened again. Those 4 soldiers who died under your command, they were soldiers first, which means they understood sacrifice. Do you really think they'd want their sacrifice to end your service to the military community? Before Maria could answer, the mess hall doors swung open and the first wave of Marines began filtering in for breakfast. The real world crashed back into their bubble of conversation, bringing with it the familiar sounds and smells of military life that Maria had been existing on the periphery of for months. We should continue this conversation somewhere more private, Colonel Mitchell said. My office, 1400 hours? Maria nodded, then caught herself. Sir, I need to ask you something. What's that? Are you going to report this? That you found me? Colonel Mitchell considered the question seriously. Officially, I had a conversation with a civilian contractor about a potential guest lecturing opportunity. Unofficially, I think Maria Santos gets to decide when and if Staff Sergeant Santos comes back. The relief on her face was unmistakable. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Thank me after you decide whether you're going to keep hiding or start living again. As Colonel Mitchell walked away, Maria returned to her cleaning with mechanical precision. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in 8 months, she was aware of the Marines around her as individuals rather than just obstacles to work around. She noticed the young corporal who always sat alone, staring at his food like he was seeing something else entirely. The staff sergeant who checked his phone obsessively, waiting for news from home. The lieutenant who carried herself with the kind of rigid confidence that meant she was terrified of making a mistake. These were her people, she realized. Not the soldiers she'd left behind in the hospital, but the ones who were still fighting, still serving, still trying to figure out how to balance duty and humanity in a world that often demanded both simultaneously. By the time she finished her shift and headed home to her small apartment off base, Maria Santos was no longer certain that invisibility was what she wanted. And for the first time since she'd walked out of Walter Reed, that uncertainty felt like hope. Maria's apartment was exactly what someone would expect from a person trying to disappear, functional, anonymous, and devoid of personality. The furnished one-bedroom unit in a complex that catered to military personnel and contractors had been perfect when she'd signed the lease. Close enough to Camp Pendleton to make her commute reasonable, far enough away to maintain separation from the life she'd left behind. She sat on her couch that evening, still in her custodial uniform, staring at the Purple Heart tattoo on her forearm. In the privacy of her own space, she didn't bother hiding it beneath long sleeves. The names wrapped around the metal seemed to pulse in the lamplight. Martinez, Johnson, Williams, Crawford. 4 soldiers who'd trusted her leadership and paid the ultimate price for that trust. Below their names, in smaller script, were 8 others: Rodriguez, Palmer, Singh, Thompson, Mitchell, Casey, Brooks, Valdez. The 12 she'd saved. The reason the Army had recommended her for the Distinguished Service Cross. Before she'd disappeared into the civilian world, her phone buzzed with a text message. Maria rarely received texts. She'd made sure of that by keeping her contact list deliberately small. But the number was familiar, even though she hadn't seen it in almost 2 years. Hey Santos, it's Diego. Long shot, but I heard someone matching your description might be working on base. If it's you, you don't have to respond. Just want you to know. I'm here if you need anything." Maria stared at the message for a long time. Captain Diego Rodriguez had been more than her closest friend in the Army. He'd been the brother she'd never had. The one person who understood her drive to succeed in a military career, despite coming from a background that hadn't prepared her for any of it. They'd both been kids from East LA who'd seen the Army as their ticket to something better, and they'd pushed each other to excel beyond what anyone expected from there. Demographic. Diego had been the one to visit her every day at Walter Reed, bringing contraband coffee and updates from their unit. He'd been the one to hold her hand during the panic attacks and talk her through the nightmares that medication couldn't touch. And he'd been the one she'd been running from when she walked out of that hospital, because seeing the pain in his eyes every time he looked at her had been more than she could bear. Now he was here, less than a mile from where she'd been hiding for 8 months. And he knew she was close. Maria's thumb hovered over the keyboard. A dozen different responses formed and dissolved in her mind. She could lie, tell him he had the wrong person. She could ignore the message entirely. Or she could do the thing that terrified her most. Tell him the truth. It's me. I'm okay. I need more time. The response came back within seconds. Take all the time you need. I love you. Herman. The Spanish endearment little sister broke something loose in Maria's chest. For 8 months, she'd been existing without connections, without the military family that had sustained her through 12 years of service. She'd convinced herself that isolation was healing, that cutting ties with her past was necessary for her survival. But sitting alone in her anonymous apartment, holding a phone that connected her to someone who'd known her before she became broken, Maria realized that isolation wasn't healing. It was just another form of dying. She opened her laptop and, for the first time since disappearing from Walter Reed, typed her real name into a search engine. The results were extensive and painful to read. News articles about the convoy ambush, complete with dramatic headlines about heroism under fire. Official Army press releases about her Purple Heart ceremony and the pending Distinguished Service Cross recommendation. Missing person reports filed by her family and friends. Forum discussions among military enthusiasts debating whether she was dead, hiding, or suffering from PTSD so severe that she couldn't function in civilian society. But buried in the search results was something she hadn't expected. A series of articles about other soldiers from her unit, the ones she'd saved, and how they were using their experiences to help other veterans transition back to civilian life. Private Rodriguez, not Diego, but Thomas Rodriguez from her squad, had become a counselor at a VA center in Arizona, specializing in combat trauma. Corporal Singh was working with a non-profit that helped veterans find employment after service. Staff Sergeant Brooks had joined a program that connected experienced soldiers with junior enlisted personnel struggling with the realities of military life. Each of them had taken their survival and turned it into service. They'd found ways to honor the soldiers who didn't make it home by helping those who did. And reading their stories, Maria felt the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in almost 2 years. Purpose beyond mere survival. Her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made her answer. Is this Maria Santos? The voice was young, female, and nervous. Who's asking? This is Lieutenant Sarah Chun, Marine Corps. I got your number from Colonel Mitchell. He said you might be willing to speak with me about combat leadership. Maria sat up straighter. Lieutenant, I'm not sure what Colonel Mitchell told you, but I'm not qualified to ma'am, with respect. Colonel Mitchell told me you saved 12 soldiers under enemy fire while wounded yourself. That sounds pretty qualified to me. There was something in the young officer's voice that made Maria pause. Not just nervousness, but desperation. The kind of raw need that came from someone who was in over her head and knew it. "What's your situation, Lieutenant?" "I'm deploying to Afghanistan in 6 weeks. First combat deployment, first time leading Marines in a hostile environment. I've been through all the training, read all the manuals, but I know that's not the same as actual experience." Maria closed her eyes, seeing herself at 24, fresh out of officer candidate school, and convinced that her training had prepared her for anything the Army could throw at her. She'd been competent, confident, and completely unprepared for the reality of making life-and-death decisions while people were shooting at her. "Lieutenant, I'm not sure I'm the right person to help you. Colonel Mitchell said you might say that. He also said to tell you that the Marines I'll be leading are the same age as the soldiers in your convoy, that they deserve to come home to their families just like your soldiers did." The words hit exactly where they were intended to. Maria could hear the young officers breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for a response that would either help her prepare for the most important responsibility of her life or leave her to figure it out alone. "What do you want to know, Lieutenant?" "Everything. How do you make decisions when there's no time to think? How do you keep your people together when everything's going wrong? How do you live with yourself when you can't save everyone?" The last question hung in the air like a challenge. Lieutenant Chun was asking about the thing Maria had been running from for almost 2 years, the impossible weight of command responsibility in combat situations where perfect solutions didn't exist. "Lieutenant, can you meet me tomorrow, somewhere off base?" "Yes, ma'am, absolutely. There's a coffee shop called Grind on Oceanside Boulevard, 1400 hours. I'll be there." After ending the call, Maria sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed isolation beginning to crumble. Colonel Mitchell had been right about one thing. Hiding wasn't honoring the soldiers who died under her command. It was just a slow form of surrender. She looked at her tattoo again, at the names that had been with her through every day of the past 2 years. For the first time, she tried to imagine what Martinez, Johnson, Williams, and Crawford would think of her current life. Would they understand her need to disappear? Would they approve of her choice to waste the experience their deaths had given her? Or would they want her to use what she'd learned, both in that convoy and in the months of recovery that followed to help other soldiers come home alive? Maria opened her laptop again and began typing, not a search this time, but an email to Colonel Mitchell accepting his offer to speak to his junior officers. It wasn't a commitment to return to military life, but it was a first step toward using her experience for something beyond self-punishment. As she hit send, she felt something she hadn't experienced since walking out of Walter Reed, the possibility that Staff Sergeant Maria Santos might have something to offer the world beyond her own guilt and regret. The next morning, Maria's routine was different. She still arrived at the base before dawn, still put on her custodial uniform and began her rounds. But now she was aware of the Marines and soldiers around her in a way she hadn't been before. She noticed the young corporal she'd seen the day before, sitting alone again, and this time she paid attention to the details that marked him as someone struggling with more than just morning fatigue. His uniform was impeccable, but his hands shook slightly as he drank his coffee. He checked his phone obsessively, the way people did when they were waiting for news they didn't want to receive. And when other Marines tried to include him in their conversations, he participated just enough to avoid attention while remaining fundamentally separate. Maria recognized the signs because she'd lived them. This was a soldier carrying weight he couldn't share, trying to maintain the appearance of normal function while dealing with something that was eating him alive from the inside. During her break, she found herself walking past his table just as he was finishing his breakfast. "Rough night?" she asked quietly, using the universal opener that gave someone permission to talk or deflect as they chose. The corporal looked up, surprised that a civilian contractor was speaking to him at all. "Sorry, ma'am. You look like you didn't sleep much." Been there myself. Something in her tone must have conveyed understanding rather than judgment, because the corporal's defensive posture softened slightly. Yeah, well, you know how it is. Actually, I do. Maria sat down across from him, ignoring the voice in her head that screamed warnings about getting involved. Want to talk about it? The corporal, his name tag read Williams, stared at her for a long moment. You're the cleaning lady. I'm Maria, and you're Corporal Williams, and you've been carrying something heavy for a while now. Williams laughed, but there was no humor in it. What makes you think that? Because I carried something heavy for a long time too. And I know what it looks like when someone's drowning on dry land. The reference to drowning seemed to hit home. Williams's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, and Maria saw the young man beneath the Marine, someone who couldn't have been more than 22, trying to handle responsibilities that would challenge someone twice his age. My SQUAD leader says I need to talk to someone, Williams said finally. Says I'm not handling things well since we got back. Got back from where? Syria. We lost someone. The words came out flat, clinical. Good Marine. Better than me, honestly. And I keep thinking about what I could have done different. Maria felt her heart contract. This conversation was too familiar, too close to her own experience. But instead of running from it, she found herself leaning forward, engaging with another soldier's pain in a way she hadn't been able to engage with her own. Tell me about him. Lance Corporal Davis, 20 years old, kid from Iowa who wanted to be a farmer after his enlistment. Always talking about soil composition and crop rotation, like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. Williams smiled slightly at the memory. We called him Farmer. What happened? Williams's smile disappeared. IED. We were on patrol, and I made the call to take a route that intel said was clear. It wasn't. Davis stepped on a pressure plate, and he shrugged, but Maria could see the effort it took to maintain that casual gesture. You blame yourself. I was the senior Marine on that patrol. It was my call, my responsibility. Davis died. Because I made the wrong decision, Maria nodded slowly. And now you can't sleep, can't eat, can't stop running through that moment and wondering what you missed. Williams stared at her. How do you know that? Because I've been there. Different. War, different circumstances, but the same weight. Maria pulled up her sleeve, exposing the purple heart tattoo for the second time in 2 days. 4 soldiers died under my command in Afghanistan. For a long time, I thought that meant I wasn't fit to lead anyone ever again. Williams's eyes widened. As he took in the tattoo, the names, the military precision of the artwork, your military, was Staff Sergeant 82nd Airborne. And Corporal Williams, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The fact that you're carrying this weight, that you're questioning your decisions and taking responsibility for your Marines, that doesn't make you unfit for leadership. That makes you exactly the kind of leader your Marines need. But Davis is dead. Yes, he is. And that's a weight you're going to carry for the rest of your life. But the question isn't whether you carry it. The question is what you do with it. Do you let it destroy you? Or do you use it to become the kind of leader who brings more Marines home alive? Williams was quiet for a long time, processing her words. Finally, he asked, how do you live with it? The knowing that someone died because of your decision. You honor them. You remember them. And you use what their death taught you to save. Other people. Maria stood up, preparing to return to her shift. Corporal Williams. Lance Corporal Davis died serving his country under a leader who cared enough about his Marines to second-guess every decision. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to build on. As she walked away, Maria realized that she'd just given Corporal Williams the advice she'd been unable to accept for herself. That survival carried obligations, not just guilt. That leadership meant taking responsibility without being destroyed by it. that the dead were honored not through self-punishment, but through service to the living. For the first time in almost 2 years, Maria Santos felt like she might have something valuable to offer the world beyond her ability to clean floors and remain invisible. The realization both terrified and exhilarated her. In equal measure, the coffee shop in Oceanside was exactly the kind of place Maria had chosen, deliberately crowded enough for anonymity, quiet enough for conversation, and far enough from base that she wouldn't run into anyone she'd spent months avoiding. She arrived 15 minutes early, a habit from her military days that she hadn't been able to shake, and claimed a corner table with clear sightlines to all entrances. Lieutenant Sarah Chun arrived precisely on time, and Maria recognized her immediately. Not because they'd met before, but because she carried herself with the particular combination of confidence and anxiety that marked every junior officer preparing for their first combat deployment. She was small, maybe 5'4", with the kind of precise bearing that suggested she'd worked twice as hard as her male counterparts to earn the respect of her Marines. "Ma'am?" Lieutenant Chun approached the table uncertainly. "Maria Santos?" "Just." "Maria, and you must be Lieutenant Chun. Coffee, please. And thank you for meeting with me. I know this is unusual." Maria studied the young officer as she sat down. Chun was probably 26, maybe 27, with the kind of earnest intensity that reminded Maria of herself at that age. But there was something else there too, a brittleness around the edges that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Lieutenant, before we start, I need you to understand something. I'm not active duty anymore. I'm not officially qualified to give you advice about anything. What I can do is share my experience and hope it helps you think through your own challenges. I understand, ma'am. And honestly, at this point I'll take any help I can get." Maria ordered coffee for both of them, using the time to decide how much of herself she was willing to reveal to this stranger. Colonel Mitchell had put her in a position she wasn't prepared for, being responsible for helping another soldier without having resolved her own issues around leadership and responsibility. "Tell me about your Marines," Maria said finally. "Lieutenant." Chun's entire demeanor shifted, becoming more animated and focused. "3rd Squad, 1st Platoon. 12 Marines, most of them on their first deployment. Good kids, well trained, but they're looking to me to keep them alive and bring them home, and I—" She paused, struggling with the admission. "I'm not sure. I know how to do that." "What makes you think other officers know how to do that?" The question seemed to surprise Chun. "Training? Experience? The fact that they've done it before?" "Lieutenant, I went into my first combat deployment thinking I knew exactly how to keep my soldiers alive. I'd been through all the schools, read all the manuals, studied every historical example of small unit leadership I could find. And you know what happened?" "What?" "4 of them died anyway." Maria watched the words hit Lieutenant Chun like a physical blow. She'd been expecting reassurance, professional wisdom, maybe some tactical advice. She hadn't been expecting brutal honesty about the reality of combat leadership. "But you saved 12, Chun said after a moment. "I made decisions under pressure. That happened to work out. That's not the same thing as knowing what I was doing. Then how do I prepare for something I can't really prepare for?" Maria leaned back in her chair, considering the question that had haunted her for almost 2 years. "You start by accepting that you can't save everyone. That no matter how good your decisions are, how careful your planning is, how much you care about your Marines, some of them might not come home. And that if that happens, it doesn't mean you failed. It means you were in a situation where perfect solutions don't exist." Lieutenant Chun was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee. "The other officers don't talk like that. The other officers probably haven't lost anyone under their command yet. Have you talked to other junior officers about this?" Maria shook her head. "You're the first. Until yesterday, I hadn't talked to anyone about my military experience in almost 2 years. Why?" The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Maria found herself looking at this young officer, someone who reminded her so much of herself at that age, and feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being asked for wisdom she wasn't sure she possessed. Because I convinced myself that if I couldn't save everyone under my command, I didn't deserve to help anyone else learn how to lead. Maria paused, realizing she was saying something aloud that she'd never admitted even to herself. I thought hiding was penance. That if I made myself small enough, invisible enough, the weight of those 4 deaths would somehow matter less. But it didn't work. No, it didn't. The weight is the same whether you're carrying it alone in a 1-bedroom apartment or sharing it with people who understand what it means. Lieutenant Chun nodded slowly. Colonel Mitchell said you might be able to help me understand tactical decision-making under pressure. What do you want to know? Everything. But specifically, how do you make the right call when you don't have enough information and people's lives depend on your choice? Maria felt her pulse quicken. This was the question that had kept her awake. For months after the convoy ambush, the one that had driven her to walk out of Walter Reed rather than face the possibility of making similar decisions again. You want the honest answer, or the answer that will help you sleep at night? The honest answer. You don't make the right call. You make the best call you can with the information you have, and then you live with the consequences. Sometimes that means everyone comes home. Sometimes it doesn't. That's terrifying. It should be. If it's not terrifying, you're not taking. It's seriously enough. Maria leaned forward. But Lieutenant, here's what I learned in that convoy. Your Marines aren't expecting you to be perfect. They're expecting you to be decisive, to take responsibility, and to care more about bringing them home than you do about your own career or reputation. How do you know when you have enough information to make a decision? You usually don't. Combat doesn't wait for perfect intelligence or ideal circumstances. You make decisions with incomplete information because the alternative is paralysis, and paralysis gets people killed. Maria found herself remembering details from the convoy ambush that she'd spent months trying to forget. The way the landscape had looked wrong, too quiet, too empty for the time of day. The radio chatter that had been routine until it suddenly wasn't. The split second when she'd had to choose between following their planned route or taking a detour that would add 40 minutes to their mission. In Afghanistan, we were escorting a supply convoy to a forward operating base. Intelligence said the route was clear, but something felt off. I had about 30 seconds to decide whether to trust my gut or stick with the plan. What did you do? I called for a route change. Took us through terrain that was harder to navigate, but offered better visibility and cover. My squad leaders questioned the decision because it wasn't what we'd briefed. Were you right? Maria nodded grimly. Later intelligence confirmed that our original route had been mined. If we'd followed the plan, the entire convoy would have been destroyed. So your instincts saved everyone. That time. But that's not the story I usually tell people. Lieutenant Chun waited, sensing there was more. 6 months later, different convoy, similar situation. Same feeling that something was wrong. This time I ignored my instincts and stuck with the planned route because I thought I was being paranoid. The ambush. Maria's voice was steady, but Chun could see the effort it took to maintain that composure. 4 soldiers died because I second-guessed myself, because I was afraid of being wrong again. But 12 lived because you made good decisions under fire. That's what everyone tells me. But Lieutenant, here's what you need to understand. You're going to make decisions that save lives, and you're going to make decisions that cost lives. Sometimes on the same day. Sometimes within the same hour. The measure of your leadership isn't whether you're perfect, it's whether you learn from your mistakes and keep making decisions when decision-making becomes impossible. Lieutenant Chun was taking notes now, scribbling in a small notebook with the intensity of someone trying to capture wisdom that might keep her Marines alive. What else should I know? Trust your NCOs. Your staff sergeant and squad leaders have more experience than you do, and they know your Marines better than you do. Listen to them, especially when they disagree with you. What if I don't know enough to evaluate their advice? Then ask questions until you do. There's no shame in being the new lieutenant who asks too many questions. There's a lot of shame in being the lieutenant who got Marines killed because she was too proud to admit she didn't understand something. Maria paused, remembering her own early days as an officer, the constant balance between projecting confidence and acknowledging ignorance. Your Marines want to trust you, Lieutenant. They want to believe that you know what you're doing and that you'll bring them home safely. But trust isn't automatic, it's earned through competence, consistency, and caring more about their welfare than your own comfort. How do you earn that trust? You learn their names, their stories, their strengths and weaknesses. You make decisions that prioritize their safety over mission convenience. You take responsibility when things go wrong instead of blaming them or circumstances beyond your control. What about when you have to ask them to do dangerous things? Maria smiled slightly. Lieutenant, they're Marines. They signed up to do dangerous things. What they didn't sign up for is doing dangerous things for leaders who don't understand the risks or don't care about minimizing casualties. Can I ask you something personal? Depends what it is. Do you regret it? Your military service, I mean. The question caught Maria off guard. In all her months of self-examination and guilt, she'd never really considered whether she regretted choosing a military career in the first place. No, she said finally. I regret specific decisions, specific moments where I could have done better. But I don't regret serving. Even with everything that happened, even with the weight I carry now, those 12 years were the most meaningful of my life. Why? Because it mattered. Every day, every decision, every small act of leadership or followership, it all mattered. In ways that most civilian jobs never do. When you're responsible for other people's lives, when you're part of something bigger than yourself, when you're serving something beyond your own immediate interests. That gives weight to everything you do. Is that why you're talking to me? Because it matters? Maria considered the question. I'm talking to you because Colonel Mitchell asked me to, and because you reminded me that hiding from responsibility isn't the same thing as being free from it. What do you mean? I mean that walking away from the military didn't make me stop being a soldier. It just made me a soldier who wasn't helping anyone. Maria looked at her watch. Lieutenant, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Okay. Are you asking for help because you're scared, or because you're serious about bringing your Marines home alive? Both. Good answer. Fear is useful if it makes you careful. It's dangerous if it makes you hesitant. How do I tell the difference? Fear that makes you double-check your planning, question your assumptions, and consider multiple options. That's good fear. Fear that makes you freeze up when decisions need to be made. That's the kind that gets people killed. Lieutenant Chun closed her notebook and looked directly at Maria. Would you be willing to meet with me again? Maybe once a week until I deploy? The request hung in the air between them. Maria felt the familiar tension between her desire to help and her fear of taking responsibility for another person's preparation for combat. But looking at this young officer, someone who reminded her so much of herself at that age, she realized that declining would be just another form of hiding. Yes, but I have conditions. Name them. First, everything we discuss stays between us unless you decide otherwise. Second, you remember that I'm sharing my experience, not giving you orders. Third, if you start having problems with sleep, appetite, or emotional regulation after you deploy, you get help immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to tough it out. Don't convince yourself that asking for help is weakness. Why that last one? Because I waited too long, and it cost me 2 years of my life. Maria stood up, preparing to leave. Lieutenant Chun, can I give you one more piece of advice? Please. Write letters to your Marines' families now. While you can think clearly and express what you really want them to know about their sons and daughters. Not the letters you hope you'll never have to send, but the ones that tell them what kind of people their kids are and how much they mean to their unit. If something happens, you'll be glad you have words ready that come from a clear head and a full heart. Lieutenant Chun's face went pale. That's really hard to think about. Everything about leadership in combat is hard to think about. That's why most people don't volunteer for it. Maria gathered her jacket. Same time next week? Yes, ma'am. And Maria, thank you. I know this isn't easy for you either. As Maria walked back to her car, she realized that Lieutenant Chen was right. It wasn't easy. But for the first time since walking out of Walter Reed, it felt necessary in a way that cleaning floors and hiding from her past never had. She was still Maria Santos, civilian contractor. But maybe, just maybe, she was also something else. A soldier who had learned something worth teaching and was finally ready to share it. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the mess hall. Maria was refilling industrial-sized containers of ketchup and mustard when she noticed a familiar figure in a CU's approaching her station. Captain Diego Rodriguez looked exactly the same as he had 2 years ago, compact, energetic, with the kind of easy confidence that made soldiers want to follow him into questionable situations. He also looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Jesus, Santos," he said quietly, stopping just close enough to talk without drawing attention from the Marines eating breakfast around them. "I wasn't sure if that text was really from you." Maria continued her work, not looking up. "It was. You've been here 18 months? "Yes." 18 months, and you've been cleaning the same mess hall I eat in every morning? "Yes." Diego ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered from 1,000 briefings and planning sessions. "Why didn't you?" "Because I wasn't ready." Maria finally looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time in almost 2 years. "I'm still not sure I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "To be Maria Santos instead of just Maria. To remember who I used to be without falling apart." Diego glanced around the mess hall, taking in her uniform, her equipment, the practiced efficiency with which she moved through her custodial duties. "Is this what you want? This life? It's what I needed." "That's not the same thing." Maria set down the ketchup container and really looked at her oldest friend. Diego had always been able to read her better than anyone else, a skill that had made him an excellent officer and an occasionally inconvenient friend. "I heard you've been looking for me," she said. "Every day for 22 months. Called every VA hospital from California to Virginia. Filed missing person reports in 6 states. Drove your mother crazy asking if she'd heard from you." "My mother knows you've been looking?" "Your mother helped me look. She's worried sick, Santos. Your whole family thinks you're dead." The guilt hit harder than Maria had expected. In her focus on escaping her own pain, she'd managed to ignore the pain her disappearance had caused for people who loved her. Her mother, her younger brother, the extended family that had celebrated her military achievements and mourned her injuries. "I couldn't face them," she said quietly. "Not after what happened. After you saved 12 soldiers and got recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. After I got 4 soldiers killed." Diego was quiet for a moment, processing the conversation they'd had a dozen times in the hospital, but never resolved. "Santos, can we go somewhere and talk? Really talk?" Maria looked around the mess hall, at the routine that had defined her life for 8 months, at the safety of being invisible and unremarkable. Then she looked at Diego, who represented everything she'd been running from and everything she'd lost when she chose isolation over connection. "I get off at 1500. There's a park on Oceanside Boulevard. I'll be there." After Diego left, Maria found it impossible to concentrate on her work. For 18 months, she'd been successful at compartmentalizing her past. keeping her memories and emotions locked away while she focused on the simple, immediate tasks of cleaning and maintenance. But seeing Diego had cracked that compartmentalization open, flooding her mind with memories she'd worked hard to suppress. She remembered their first meeting at Fort Bragg, two young soldiers from similar backgrounds, who'd recognized something in each other that made them natural allies. She remembered late-night conversations about their families, their goals, their shared determination to prove that kids from East LA could succeed in an institution that hadn't traditionally welcomed people like them. She remembered Diego holding her hand in the hospital while she cried about the soldiers she'd lost, and his patient insistence that surviving didn't make her guilty of anything except being human. Most of all, she remembered walking away from him without explanation, leaving him to wonder what had happened to the person who'd been like a sister to him for almost a decade. The afternoon meeting at the park was awkward in ways that surprised them both. They'd been through combat together, shared the kind of experiences that bonded soldiers for life, but sitting on a park bench in civilian clothes felt strangely formal and distant. "You look good," Diego said finally. "Healthier than you did." At Walter Reed, "I feel better most days, but not all days." Maria shrugged. "Some days are harder than others. But I'm not falling apart anymore, if that's what you're asking." "What are you doing, Santos?" "Really? Because cleaning floors for 8 months doesn't sound like any kind of life plan. It's honest work. It serves the military community. It lets me contribute without having to be responsible for anyone else's life. And it lets you hide." "Yes," Maria admitted. "It lets me hide." Diego leaned back on the bench, studying her profile. "Remember when we were kids at Bragg, and you used to talk about making a difference? About being the kind of leader who brought everyone home? I remember. What happened to that person?" "She got 4 soldiers killed. She saved 12 soldiers." "Diego, we've had this argument. You're not going to convince me that losing people under my command was acceptable just because I managed to save more than I lost. I'm not trying to convince you it was acceptable. I'm trying to convince you that it was survivable." The distinction hit Maria harder than she'd expected. For almost 2 years, she'd been operating under the assumption that what had happened to her in Afghanistan was something to be endured rather than something to be integrated and moved beyond. "I've been talking to a Marine lieutenant," she said suddenly, "about combat leadership. Colonel Mitchell asked me to share my experience with junior officers." Diego's eyebrows rose. "How does that feel?" "Terrifying. But also necessary. Like maybe what happened to me could help someone else's Marines come home alive." "That sounds like the Santos I remember." "I'm not the same person I was, Diego. I can't just go back to being Staff Sergeant Santos and pretend. The last 2 years didn't happen. I'm not asking you to go back. I'm asking you to go forward." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching families play on the playground equipment and joggers follow the winding path through the park. It was the kind of normal civilian life that Maria had been observing from a distance for months, never quite feeling entitled to participate in it. "Your mother wants to see you," Diego said eventually. "I know. She doesn't care about Afghanistan or the hospital or why you disappeared. She just wants to know that her daughter is alive and—" "Okay. I'm not sure I know how to be her daughter anymore." "Then start by calling her and finding out." Maria pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long moment. Her mother's number was still in her contacts, unchanged since the day she'd walked out of Walter Reed. One phone call would end almost 2 years of self-imposed exile from her family. "What if she asks questions I can't answer?" "Then you tell her you can't answer them yet. Santos, your mother raised you to be strong enough to serve your country in combat. She's strong enough to handle whatever you're dealing with now." Maria scrolled to her mother's contact information but didn't press call. "Diego, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you ever think about the soldiers we lost?" Not just in my convoy, but all of them, over all the deployments. Every day. How do you live with it? Diego considered the question seriously. I honor them by being the best officer I can be for the soldiers who are still alive. I use what? Their deaths taught me to make better decisions for the people under my command. And I remember that they were soldiers who understood the risks and chose to serve anyway. That's very healthy and well-adjusted of you. It took me 3 years of therapy to get there. The admission surprised Maria. Diego had always seemed so capable of handling the emotional demands of military leadership, so naturally resilient in the face of loss and trauma. You went to therapy? Started right after you disappeared, actually. Turns out losing my best friend on top of everything else was more than I could handle alone. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be present. Be alive. Be willing to let people care about you again. Maria looked at her phone again, then at Diego, then at the normal civilian families around them, living their normal civilian lives. For 8 months, she'd convinced herself that she was content to exist on the periphery of other people's stories. But sitting here with her oldest friend, she realized that she was tired of being a side character in her own life. If I call her, will you stay while I do it? Of course. Maria pressed call before she could change her mind. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Mia? The single word daughter broke something loose in Maria's chest. She'd forgotten how much love her mother could pack into one syllable, how much hope and worry and desperate affection could be conveyed in the space of a question. Hi Mama, it's me. Dios mío. Maria, where are you? Are you okay? Are you hurt? I'm okay, Mama. I'm in California. I'm safe. Why didn't you call? Do you know how worried we've been? Your brother thinks you're dead. I've been lighting candles for you every Sunday for 2 years. Maria found herself crying not the careful, controlled tears she'd allowed herself in private, but the messy, overwhelming tears of someone who'd been holding too much inside for too long. I'm sorry, Mama. I was hurt and I was scared and I didn't know how to come home. Mia, you don't have to come home to call your mother. You just have to remember that you have people who love you no matter what happened to you. I know. I forgot for a while, but I know. They talked for 20 minutes careful conversation that avoided the hard questions, while re-establishing the basic connection between mother and daughter. Maria's mother didn't ask about Afghanistan or the hospital or why she'd disappeared. She asked about Maria's health, her housing situation, whether she was eating enough and sleeping well. When the call ended, Maria felt simultaneously drained and energized, like she'd just finished a difficult workout that had pushed her past her previous limits. How do you feel? Diego asked. Like I just remembered that I have a family. You do, and not just your biological family. You have a military family too. People who've been waiting for you to come back. I don't know if I'm ready for that yet. Then don't come back all at once. Keep talking to Lieutenant Chun. Keep helping Colonel Mitchell with his program. Keep taking small steps toward being Staff Sergeant Santos again. What if I never want to be Staff Sergeant Santos again? Then be Maria Santos, who used to be Staff Sergeant Santos. Be someone who takes her experience and uses it to help other people without having to wear the uniform or carry the rank. The suggestion opened up possibilities that Maria hadn't considered. She'd been thinking in binary terms, either hiding completely or returning to military life entirely. But Diego was suggesting a third option: integration rather than isolation. Service without uniform, contribution without complete commitment. Diego, can I ask you another favor? Name it. Don't tell anyone else you found me. Not yet. I need time to figure out what coming back looks like before everyone knows I'm here. How much time? I don't know. Weeks, maybe months. I need to be sure I can handle the attention before I invite it. Diego nodded. But Santos, you have to promise me something in return. What? You have to keep moving forward. No more hiding, No more pretending that being invisible is the same thing as being healed. You don't have to go back to who you were, but you can't stay who you've been for the last 8 months. Okay, and you have to call your mother once a week. Okay, and you have to let me take you to dinner sometime because I've missed my best friend and I want to hear about everything that's happened to you in the last 2 years. Okay. As they walked back to their cars, Maria realized that for the first time since walking out of Walter Reed, she felt like she was moving towards something rather than away from it. The future was still uncertain, still complicated by questions she couldn't answer and responsibilities she wasn't sure she was ready to accept, but for the first time in almost 2 years, she was no longer facing that uncertainty alone. The following Tuesday, Maria found herself in an unfamiliar position, sitting at the head of a conference table in Colonel Mitchell's office, facing 8 Marine lieutenants who looked exactly as nervous as she felt. The room smelled of coffee and the particular mixture of anticipation and anxiety that accompanied any military briefing where careers might be influenced by performance. Colonel Mitchell had been deliberately vague about her background when introducing her, referring to her simply as Maria Santos, a civilian contractor with extensive combat leadership experience. The lieutenants, 6 men and 2 women, all appearing to be in their mid to late 20s, studied her with the kind of polite attention that suggested they weren't entirely sure why they were there. "Lieutenants," Colonel Mitchell began, "Ms. Santos has graciously agreed to share some real-world scenarios and discuss tactical decision-making under pressure. I'll turn it over to her." As the colonel left the room, Maria felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 8 young officers who would soon be leading Marines in combat situations, looking to her for wisdom she wasn't sure she possessed. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 8 months she'd been hiding from leadership responsibilities, and now she was being asked to teach leadership to people whose decisions would determine whether their Marines came home alive. "Before we start," Maria said, "I want to establish some ground rules. Everything we discuss in this room stays in this room. If you disagree with something I say, speak up. I'm sharing my experience, not gospel truth. And if any of this becomes overwhelming or triggers something you need to deal with, step out. Taking care of yourself isn't weakness, it's responsibility." Lieutenant Chun, sitting at the far end of the table, gave her a small nod of encouragement. "How many of you have been in combat?" Maria asked. 3 hands went up, all male lieutenants, who looked like they'd aged beyond their years in the particular way that combat experience created. "And how many of you have lost people under your command?" 1 hand remained up. Lieutenant Torres, a compact man with serious eyes and the kind of controlled stillness that marked someone carrying invisible weight. "Lieutenant Torres, what's the hardest part about losing someone under your command?" Torres was quiet for a moment, clearly not expecting to be put on the spot. "Ma'am, it's the knowing that their families are going to get a knock on their door because of a decision you made. Even if it was the right decision, especially if it was the right decision. If it was the wrong decision, you can tell yourself you screwed up and you'll do better next time. If it was the right decision and someone still died, that means sometimes there are no good options." Maria felt something tighten in her chest. Torres had articulated something she'd never been able to put into words. The particular weight of losing people, not through incompetence or cowardice, but through the cruel mathematics of situations where all available choices carried unacceptable costs. "That's exactly right, Lieutenant. And that's what we're here to talk about, how to make decisions when all your options are bad, and how to live with the consequences of those decisions." She pulled up a map on the conference room's projection system, showing a section of rural Afghanistan that looked deceptively peaceful in satellite imagery. "September 15th, 2022. I'm leading a convoy escort mission, 3 supply trucks heading to Forward Operating Base Chapman. Standard route, good weather. Intelligence reports indicating minimal enemy activity in the area. The lieutenants leaned forward, recognizing the beginning of a real-world case study. 30 minutes into the mission, we start getting radio chatter that doesn't feel right. Nothing specific, just ... off. The kind of electronic signature that suggests someone's coordinating movement in our area. What kind of off? Asked Lieutenant Morrison, one of the combat veterans. Increased radio traffic on frequencies we'd been monitoring. Short, coded bursts that suggested tactical communication rather than normal civilian activity. And the pattern was following our route. Maria advanced to the next slide, showing their planned path and the terrain features around. At this point, I have to make a decision. Do I continue with the planned route and risk walking into an ambush, or do I take a detour that adds 40 minutes to our mission and might be completely unnecessary? What did your NCOs think? Asked Lieutenant Chun. My staff sergeant wanted to stick with the plan. His point was that we'd been operating in that area for months without significant contact, and changing routes without hard intelligence was reactive decision-making that could become a bad habit. But you changed routes. Anyway, Torres asked. I did. And I spent the entire detour wondering if I was making a mistake, if I was being paranoid, if I was wasting time and resources chasing shadows. Were you? Maria smiled grimly. 3 days later, we found out that our original route had been mined the night before our mission. If we'd followed the plan, the entire convoy would have been destroyed. She watched the lieutenants process this information, seeing the relief on their faces that suggested they thought this was going to be a story about trusting your instincts and making good decisions. So the lesson is to trust your gut? Asked Lieutenant Patterson. That's what I thought the lesson was. For 6 months, I told that story as an example of how experience and intuition could save lives. I used it to justify questioning intelligence reports and taking calculated risks based on environmental cues. Maria advanced to the next slide, showing a different map, a different route. March 3, 2023. Different convoy, similar mission. Same feeling that something was wrong. Radio chatter, pattern recognition, environmental cues that suggested potential enemy activity. The room went quiet. The lieutenants were beginning to understand that this story wasn't going to have the same ending. This time, I ignored my instincts. I'd been thinking about the previous mission, about how close I'd come to making an unnecessary route change based on paranoia. I decided to trust the intelligence reports and stick with the planned route. The ambush, Lieutenant Torres said quietly. The ambush. Complex attack IEDs followed by small arms fire and RPGs. Coordinated. Well planned, executed by people who knew exactly when and where we'd be traveling. Maria paused, giving the lieutenants time to absorb what they were hearing. She could see them struggling with the contradiction between the two stories. The way that identical decision-making processes had led to opposite outcomes. 4 soldiers died in that attack. 12 survived. But the question that kept me awake for months afterward was this. If my instincts were right the first time, why were they wrong the second time? Maybe they weren't wrong, suggested Lieutenant Chen. Maybe the attack would have been worse if you'd taken a different route. Maybe. Or maybe I overthought the situation and let fear of making the wrong decision prevent me from making any decision at all. Maria looked around the table. Lieutenants, here's what I want you to take away from these 2 stories. Sometimes you'll make exactly the right decision and people will still die. Sometimes you'll make the wrong decision and everyone will survive. The quality of your decision-making isn't measured by outcomes you can't control. It's measured by the process you use to gather information, consider options, and act decisively when action is required. But how do you live with it when the wrong decision gets people killed? Asked Lieutenant Morrison. It was the question Maria had been dreading, the one she still wasn't sure she could answer effectively. You honor them. You learn from what went wrong. You use their sacrifice to make better decisions for the people who are still alive. And you remember that they were soldiers who understood the risks and chose to serve anyway. She was echoing Diego's words from their conversation in the park, advice she was still learning to believe herself. You don't forget them, and you don't pretend their deaths don't matter. But you also don't let guilt over their deaths prevent you from being effective for the Marines who are counting on you to bring them home. Lieutenant Torres raised his hand. Ma'am, how do you tell the difference between healthy responsibility and destructive guilt? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maria realized that these young officers were asking her to articulate lessons she was still learning, to provide guidance she was still seeking for herself. Healthy responsibility motivates you to improve your decision-making and take better care of your people. Destructive guilt convinces you that you don't deserve to lead anyone because you've failed before. Which one have you been living with? Torres asked. Maria smiled ruefully. For the last 2 years, destructive guilt. That's why I've been cleaning floors instead of using my experience to help people like you prepare for the decisions you're going to have to make. What changed? I met a Marine lieutenant who reminded me that hiding from responsibility isn't the same thing as being free from it. Maria glanced at Lieutenant Chen, who was taking notes with the same intensity she'd shown during their coffee shop meeting. Lieutenants, I want to give you an exercise. Over the next week, I want you to think about a decision you've made, military or civilian. Doesn't matter, that had consequences you didn't expect. Not necessarily bad consequences, just different from what you intended. Next week, we'll discuss how you might have made that decision differently, and what factors you might have missed or misweighted. Are we being graded on this? Asked Lieutenant Patterson. You're being graded on this every day for the rest of your military careers. The only difference is that next week, we'll talk about it in a room where making mistakes doesn't get anyone killed. As the meeting ended and the lieutenants filed out, Maria felt the familiar exhaustion that came from emotional exposure. She'd shared more about her experiences in the last hour than she had in the previous 8 months, and the vulnerability left her feeling raw and uncertain. Ms. Santos? Lieutenant Torres had lingered after the others left. Thank you for telling us those stories. I know they weren't easy to share. Lieutenant, can I ask you about the Marine you lost? Lance Corporal Davis, IED in Syria 6 months ago. How are you handling it? Torres was quiet for a moment. Some days better than others. But talking to you today helped me realize that I'm not the only one carrying this kind of weight. You're definitely not alone. And Torres? The fact that you're here, that you're still leading Marines and taking responsibility for their welfare, Davis would be proud of that. How do you know? Because he was a Marine, which means he understood what it meant to trust his leader with his life. You honored that trust by bringing the rest of your unit home, and you're honoring it now by learning how to be a better leader for your next deployment. After Torres left, Maria sat alone in the conference room, processing what had just happened. For the first time since walking out of Walter Reed, she'd taken her most painful experiences and used them to help other people prepare for similar challenges. It hadn't healed her trauma or erased her guilt, but it had transformed her, suffering into something that might prevent other people suffering. The realization was both profound and terrifying. She might actually be good at this teaching thing. And that meant she had responsibilities she couldn't walk away from again. Word spread quickly through Camp Pendleton's officer community that Colonel Mitchell's leadership development program had acquired an exceptional guest instructor. Maria noticed the change immediately after just a few weeks of teaching Marines, who had never acknowledged her existence during her 18 months of cleaning. Suddenly nodded when she passed them in corridors. The attention made her profoundly uncomfortable. You're becoming famous, Corporal Williams observed during one of their increasingly regular conversations. He'd started seeking her out during his meals, treating their talks as informal counseling sessions that helped him process his guilt over Lance Corporal Davis's death. "I'm not trying to be famous," Maria replied, refilling condiment dispensers with more force than necessary. "I'm trying to help a few officers prepare for deployment." "Ma'am, with respect, you can't share the kind of stories you're sharing and expect to stay invisible. People talk." Williams was right, and Maria knew it. The previous week's session with the lieutenants had been followed by requests from other units, phone calls from officers at different bases, and even an inquiry from the Marine Corps' War College about developing curriculum based on her experiences. "The thing is," Williams continued, "people need to hear what you're saying. Not just officers, but NPOs like me who are trying to figure out how to live with the weight of command decisions." Maria paused in her work, studying the young corporal who'd become an unexpected confidant. In the weeks since their first conversation, she'd watched him transform from someone who was barely functioning to someone who was actively working through his trauma while maintaining his effectiveness as a Marine. "How are you sleeping?" she asked. "Better. Still not great, but better. The nightmares are less frequent, and when they do come, I don't wake up feeling like I'm drowning." "And the guilt?" Williams considered the question seriously. "It's different now. Still there, but it feels more like responsibility than punishment. Like maybe Davis's death means something if I use what I learned to be a better leader for my next Marines." Maria nodded, recognizing the shift in perspective that marked the difference between destructive guilt and constructive grief. "That's healthy thinking, Corporal. I learned it from you." The simple statement hit Maria harder than she'd expected. For 8 months, she'd convinced herself that her only value lay in remaining invisible, in serving without leading, in contributing without taking responsibility. But Williams's transformation suggested something different, that her experiences, properly shared, could help other people navigate similar challenges. "Williams, can I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am. Do you think I should keep doing this?" "The teaching, I mean." Williams stared at her like she'd asked whether water was wet. "Ma'am, you just helped me figure out how to live with losing one of my Marines. You're helping Lieutenant Chun prepare to lead her first combat deployment. You're giving officers real-world experience that might save their Marines' lives. Why would you stop?" "Because I'm not sure I'm qualified to be anyone's teacher. I'm still figuring out how to live with my own experiences." "Ma'am, respectfully, that's exactly what makes you qualified. You're not some retired general giving lectures about theories you read in books. You're someone who's been through the worst parts of military leadership and found a way to keep going." Before Maria could respond, her phone buzzed with a text. "From Lieutenant Chun, emergency. Can you meet me at the coffee shop? Need advice about something that happened today." Maria excused herself from her conversation with Williams and drove to Oceanside. Finding Lieutenant Chen sitting in their usual corner booth, looking shaken in a way that immediately triggered Maria's protective instincts. "What happened?" Maria asked, sliding into the seat across from her. "Training exercise went wrong. Live fire exercise, and one of my Marines, Lance Corporal Rodriguez, took a round to the shoulder. Friendly fire incident." Maria felt her stomach clench. Training accidents were every officer's nightmare, the kind of scenario that could destroy careers and haunt leaders for decades. "How bad?" "He'll recover fully. Clean through and through, no permanent damage." "But Maria, it was my fault. I positioned the squad wrong. Didn't account for the crossfire potential when we were setting up." "The exercise. Were you following proper safety protocols?" "Yes, but I missed something. Made an assumption about fields of fire that turned out to be wrong." Maria studied Lieutenant Chun's face, seeing the particular kind of devastation that came from realizing your mistakes could have killed someone under your command. "Tell me exactly what happened." Lieutenant Chun walked through the incident step by step, the positioning decisions, the communication protocols, the moment when she'd realized that her squad placement had created a dangerous crossfire situation. It was the kind of mistake that experienced officers made regularly during training, the reason why training existed in the first place. "Lieutenant, have you talked to your company commander about this?" "Yes, he said it was a good learning experience. That these kinds of mistakes are why we train with live ammunition under controlled conditions." "But Maria, I keep thinking about what would have happened if that round had been 6 inches to the left." "It wasn't." "But it could have been." "Yes, it could have been. And if it had been, you would have had to live with that." "But it wasn't, which means you get to learn from this mistake without losing a Marine." Lieutenant Chun stared into her coffee. "How do you live with the uncertainty? Knowing that every decision you make could be the one that gets someone killed. You accept that. Uncertainty is part of command responsibility. You do everything you can to minimize risks, you learn from your mistakes, and you remember that your Marines signed up to serve, knowing that military service involves unavoidable dangers. But what if I'm not good enough? What if I make the same kind of mistake in combat and someone dies because I'm incompetent?" Maria leaned forward. "Lieutenant, listen to me very carefully. The fact that you're questioning yourself after a training accident means you're exactly the kind of officer your Marines need. Someone who takes responsibility seriously, who learns from mistakes, who cares more about their welfare than your own comfort." "But I made a mistake that could have killed someone." "Yes, you did. And now you know to double-check crossfire potentials during squad positioning. That's one mistake you'll never make again, and your Marines will be safer because of it." "What if there are other mistakes I haven't made yet?" "There are. You'll make dozens of mistakes during your military career. Some will be inconsequential, some will be embarrassing, and some might cost lives. The measure of your leadership isn't whether you make mistakes, it's how you respond to them and what you learn from them." Lieutenant Chun was quiet for a long time, processing Maria's words. Finally, she asked, "Do you think I should still deploy with my unit? Do you think you should?" "I want to. But I'm scared that I'll make another mistake, and this time someone will die because of it." "Lieutenant, that fear, that healthy fear of making mistakes that could cost lives, is what will make you a careful, thoughtful leader. Officers who aren't afraid of making fatal mistakes are the ones who actually make them." "How do I carry that fear without letting it paralyze me?" "You use it to make you more careful, more thorough, more willing to listen to your NCOs, and more committed to learning everything you can about keeping your Marines alive. Fear becomes a problem when it prevents you from making decisions. Fear becomes an asset when it motivates you to make better decisions." Maria watched as some of the tension left Lieutenant Chun's shoulders. The young officer was still processing the trauma of nearly losing a Marine, but she was beginning to understand that the incident was a learning opportunity rather than evidence of her unfitness for command. "Maria, can I ask you something personal?" "Depends what it is." "Are you going back to active duty?" The question caught Maria off guard. For weeks, people had been hinting at the possibility, but no one had asked directly whether she was considering returning to military service. "I don't know," she said honestly. 3 months ago, I would have said absolutely not. Now, I'm not sure what I want. What's changed? I'm remembering why I became a soldier in the first place. And I'm realizing that hiding from leadership responsibilities isn't the same thing as being free from them. Would you consider coming back as an instructor? Permanently, I mean. Maria had been avoiding that exact question for weeks, even as the requests for her teaching services multiplied and the impact of her instruction became increasingly obvious. "I'm not qualified to be a permanent instructor. You're the most qualified person I've ever met to teach combat leadership. You've been where we're going, you've made the decisions we're going to have to make, and you've learned how to live with the consequences. I've learned how to survive the consequences. That's not the same thing as learning how to live with them. Isn't it though? Isn't survival the first step toward everything else?" The question stayed with Maria as she drove home that evening. processing another conversation that had forced her to confront possibilities she wasn't ready to consider. The idea of returning to active duty, even in an instructional capacity, felt simultaneously appealing and terrifying. She was still Maria. Santos, civilian contractor who cleaned floors and tried to remain invisible. But she was also becoming something else, a teacher, a mentor, someone whose experiences might save other people's lives. The transformation was happening whether she wanted it or not, and Maria was beginning to realize that the only choice she had was whether to embrace it or resist it. As she pulled into her apartment complex, her phone rang with a call from an unfamiliar number. "Miss Santos? This is Brigadier General Patricia Williams, Marine Corps Training and Education Command. I'd like to discuss a proposition with you." And just like that, Maria's carefully controlled re-entry into military life became something much larger and more complicated than she'd ever intended. The meeting with Brigadier General Patricia Williams took place the following afternoon in Colonel Mitchell's office, with Mitchell himself present as both witness and advocate. Maria had spent the morning in a state of barely controlled anxiety, alternating between cleaning supplies with mechanical precision and staring at her reflection in bathroom mirrors, trying to see herself as others apparently saw her. General Williams was not what Maria had expected. Instead of the stern, intimidating figure she'd envisioned, the general was a compact woman in her early 50s with intelligent eyes and the kind of practical bearing that suggested she'd risen through the ranks by solving problems rather than playing politics. "Miss Santos," General Williams began, "I've been hearing remarkable things about your work with Colonel Mitchell's program. Officers from 3 different bases have requested similar instruction, and the feedback from your students has been unprecedented." Maria glanced at Colonel Mitchell, who nodded encouragingly. "General, I appreciate the kind words, but I'm not sure what kind of proposition you're referring to. I want to offer you a position as a civilian instructor with the Marine Corps Training and Education Command. You'd be developing curriculum, training other instructors, and working directly with officers at various stages of their careers. It would be a permanent position, full benefits, and significant autonomy in how you structure your programs." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Maria felt her carefully constructed walls of resistance crumbling as she considered what General Williams was proposing: a return to military service without the uniform, a chance to use her experiences to save lives without accepting the rank and responsibility that had once defined her identity. "General, I'm honored, but I need to be honest about my background. I disappeared from Walter Reed without authorization almost 2 years ago. I walked away from a psychiatric treatment program and have been essentially AWOL ever since. I know exactly who you are, Staff Sergeant Santos. I know about Afghanistan, about the convoy ambush, about your Purple Heart and your recommended Distinguished Service Cross. I also know about your disappearance from Walter Reed and the search efforts that followed." General Williams leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "What I don't know is whether you're ready to stop running from your experiences and start using them to help other people. I've been helping other people. I've been teaching Colonel Mitchell's officers, working with individual Marines who are struggling with combat trauma. You've been testing the waters, seeing if you can handle being Maria Santos again without falling apart." General Williams's directness was both uncomfortable and refreshing. "The question now is whether you're ready to dive in completely." Maria looked around the office, taking in the military memorabilia, the photographs of Marines in various combat zones, the tangible evidence of lives dedicated to service. For 8 months, she'd existed on the periphery of this world, contributing just enough to feel useful while maintaining enough distance to feel safe. What would this position actually involve? You'd be based here at Camp Pendleton initially, but you'd travel to other installations to conduct training. You'd work with our curriculum development team to create standardized programs based on your experiences. You'd train other instructors so we can scale your methods to reach more officers. And I'd do all this as a civilian? You'd do it as Maria Santos, former staff sergeant, combat veteran, and expert in tactical decision-making under pressure. Your civilian status would actually be an advantage. Officers might be more willing to open up about their fears and uncertainties with someone who's not in their chain of command. Colonel Mitchell spoke up for the first time since the introductions. Maria, I've watched you work with these young officers. You have a gift for helping people process trauma and responsibility without minimizing either. That's not a skill you can teach in a classroom. It comes from having been through the fire yourself. What about my status? The fact that I disappeared without authorization? General Williams waved dismissively. You were a wounded soldier who left a medical facility when you felt you weren't receiving appropriate treatment. Given your service record and the circumstances, I think we can classify that as a medical discharge that got lost in paperwork rather than unauthorized absence. The casual dismissal of what had felt like an insurmountable legal and military obstacle left Maria momentarily speechless. You can do that? I can do a lot of things when they serve the Marine Corps' interests. And training our officers with real-world experience from someone who's proven capable of making life-and-death decisions under fire definitely serves our interests. Maria felt the weight of possibility settling on her shoulders. For 2 years, she'd been operating under the assumption that her military career was over, that her disappearance from Walter Reed had burned all bridges back to the world that had once defined her identity. General Williams was offering her a bridge back, not to who she'd been, but to who she might become. I need time to think about this. How much time? A week, maybe 2. Take the time you need, but don't take too long. We have officers deploying next month who could benefit from your instruction. As General Williams prepared to leave, she turned back to Maria. Miss Santos, can I give you some advice? Of course, ma'am. Stop thinking about this as going back to who you were. You can't go back, none of us can. But you can decide who you want to become next. That evening, Maria called her mother for the second time in 2 years. The conversation had become a weekly ritual since their reunion call, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she was calling not just to maintain connection, but to seek advice about a decision that would reshape her future. Mia, you sound different tonight, her mother observed after they'd covered the usual topics of health, weather, and family news. I got offered a job today. A good job, working with the military again. And Sirio, tell me about it. Maria found herself explaining General Williams's offer in detail, describing the teaching position, the travel requirements, the opportunity to use her military experience to help other soldiers. As she talked, she realized she was trying to convince herself as much as her mother. This sounds like important work, her mother said when Maria finished. Why do you sound uncertain? Because I'm scared, Mama. For 2 years, I've been hiding from anything that felt like real responsibility. This job would put me back in the middle of military life, working with people who depend on me to prepare them for combat. What if I'm not ready? What if I fail them? Mia, do you remember when you first told me you wanted to join the army? I was 17. You cried. I cried because I was proud and terrified at the same time. Proud that my daughter wanted to serve something bigger than herself, terrified that I was going to lose her to something I didn't understand. Maria remembered that conversation vividly, the kitchen table in their small apartment in East LA. Her mother's work-worn hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, the weight of a decision that would change both their lives. What did you tell me then? I told you that fear was normal, but that running from opportunities because you're afraid is how you end up regretting the life you didn't live. And now? Now I'm telling you the same thing. You've been hiding for 2 years, Mia. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and start living again. The simple wisdom hit harder than any of the professional advice or military counseling Maria had received. Her mother had always possessed the ability to cut through complexity and identify the essential truth of any situation. "Mama, what if I take this job and I can't handle it? What if I have another breakdown?" "Then you'll get help and figure out how to handle it. But what if you don't take the job and spend the rest of your life wondering what you could have accomplished? If you'd been brave enough to try." After ending the call, Maria sat in her apartment, surrounded by the anonymous furniture and impersonal decorations that had defined her hiding place for 8 months. For the first time, the space felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison, a place where she'd been existing rather than living. Her phone buzzed with a text from Diego. "Heard through the grapevine that you got an interesting offer today. Want to talk about it?" Maria smiled despite herself. Military bases were small communities where news traveled at the speed of gossip, especially news involving missing soldiers who'd been presumed dead. "How did you hear about it?" "Colonel Mitchell may have mentioned something to someone who mentioned something to me, so." "So what? So are you going to take it?" Maria stared at the question for a long time before responding. "I don't know. It feels like a big step. It is a big step. The question is whether you're ready to take it. Are you going to be disappointed if I say no? I'm going to be disappointed if you make your decision based on fear instead of what you actually want." The honesty in Diego's response forced Maria to confront a question she'd been avoiding. What did she actually want? For 2 years, she'd been focused on what she was running from rather than what she was running toward. "Can I ask you something?" "Always. Do you think I'm the same person I was before Afghanistan?" "No, you're different. But different doesn't mean broken. And it doesn't mean less capable. How am I different?" "You're more careful now, more thoughtful about consequences, less willing to take unnecessary risks with other people's lives. Those aren't bad changes for someone who might be teaching combat." Leadership. Maria found herself nodding at her phone. Diego had articulated something she'd been struggling to understand, that her trauma had changed her, but not necessarily in ways that made her less effective as a leader or teacher. The old Maria Santos was confident, maybe overconfident. She thought her training and experience could handle anything the army threw at her. And the new Maria Santos knows that confidence without humility gets people killed. Knows that every decision has consequences you can't anticipate. Knows that leadership means carrying weight you can't share. Sounds like exactly the kind of person who should be teaching junior officers. The next morning brought an unexpected crisis that would test everything Maria had been learning about herself and her capabilities. She was conducting her regular cleaning routine in the mess hall when Corporal Williams approached her with obvious urgency. "Ma'am, I need your help. We've got a situation with one of my junior Marines." Maria set down her supplies, immediately shifting into the kind of focused attention that emergencies required. "What's going on?" Private First Class Rodriguez, not related to Captain Rodriguez, came back from leave yesterday. "Something happened at home, and he's not handling it well." Define not handling it well. He's talking about not wanting to be around anymore. Says his family would be better off without him. Says he's tired of being responsible for other people's problems. Maria felt ice form in her stomach. Suicide ideation among military personnel was something she'd encountered before, both as a leader and as someone who'd struggled with her own dark thoughts during the worst days at Walter Reed. Where is he now? Barracks. His roommate is with him. "But ma'am, I don't think this is something we can handle at the squad level. He needs professional help." "You're absolutely right. Have you contacted the chaplain? Mental health services?" "Working on it, but it's going to take time to get someone here, and I'm worried about leaving him alone." Maria found herself at a crossroads. As a civilian contractor, she had no official authority or responsibility to deal with a Marine in crisis. She could advise Corporal Williams to follow proper channels and wait for qualified personnel to arrive. It would be the safe, appropriate, bureaucratically correct response. But PFC Rodriguez was a young Marine in crisis, and Maria had experience with both military leadership and personal trauma that might help keep him alive until professional help arrived. Williams, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not qualified to provide mental health treatment, and anything I do here is unofficial and outside my normal responsibilities. Understood, ma'am. But I've been where Rodriguez is right now, and I might be able to help him get through the next few hours until someone with actual credentials can take over. Will you come with me? Maria looked around the mess hall, at the routine that had defined her life for 8 months, at the safety of invisibility and minimal responsibility. Then she looked at Corporal Williams, who was asking her to step back into the kind of leadership role she'd been avoiding since walking out of Walter Reed. Let's go. The walk to the barracks felt like a journey between two different versions of herself. Maria Santos, the cleaning lady, would have made excuses, cited liability concerns, insisted that she wasn't qualified to help. But Staff Sergeant Santos, the leader who'd kept 12 soldiers alive under enemy fire, wouldn't walk away from a Marine in crisis just because it wasn't technically her job. PFC Rodriguez was 19 years old, barely older than some of the soldiers who died in her convoy. He was sitting on his bunk, staring at the wall with the kind of 1,000-yard stare that suggested he was seeing something other than the present moment. His roommate, another young Marine, was hovering nearby with the helpless expression of someone who wanted to help but didn't know how. Rodriguez, Corporal Williams said gently, "This is Maria Santos. She's someone who's been through some tough times and might be able to help you figure things out." Rodriguez looked up at Maria with eyes that were both young and ancient, the kind of expression that came from carrying more weight than someone his age should have to bear. "Are you a shrink?" "No, I'm someone who used to be a soldier and who's had some experience with feeling like the world would be better off without me." The honesty in her answer seemed to surprise Rodriguez. "You felt like that?" "For about 6 months, I was pretty sure that everyone I cared about would be safer and happier if I just disappeared completely. What stopped you?" Maria sat down on the bunk across from Rodriguez, maintaining eye contact while projecting the kind of calm authority that had once been second nature to her. "A couple of things. First, I realized that my death wouldn't actually solve any of the problems I was worried about. It would just create new problems for different people. Second, I figured out that feeling like I wanted to die wasn't the same thing as actually wanting to be dead. I don't understand the difference. Wanting to die usually means wanting the pain to stop, wanting the responsibility to end, wanting to escape from circumstances that feel impossible to handle. Actually wanting to be dead means being okay with never seeing another sunset, never laughing at another joke, never having the chance to help another person or make any kind of difference in the world." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, processing her words. What if the pain doesn't stop? What if the circumstances don't get better? Then you learn to carry the pain without letting it define you. You find ways to make the circumstances more manageable. You discover that surviving impossible situations is a skill you can develop, just like any other skill. How? One day at a time, one decision at a time, one breath at a time if that's what it takes. Maria glanced at Corporal Williams, who was taking notes in a small notebook, probably documenting the conversation for the mental health professionals who would eventually take over Rodriguez's care. "Rodriguez, can you tell me what happened at home that's got you feeling this way?" The young Marine's composure cracked slightly. "My little sister. She's 14, and she's been getting into trouble drugs, staying out all night, hanging out with guys who are way too old for her. My mom asked me to talk to her during leave, and I just ... I made everything worse." "How did you make it worse?" "I yelled at her, told her she was being stupid and irresponsible, told her she was breaking Mom's heart and that she needed to get her act together." Rodriguez's voice was flat, emotionless. "She ran away that night. Been gone 3 days, and nobody knows where she is." Maria felt her heart contract. Rodriguez was carrying the weight of family responsibility on top of his military duties, blaming himself for a family crisis that was probably years in the making. Rodriguez, how old were you when you joined the Marines? 18. Right out of high school. And before you left for boot camp, was your sister already showing signs of the problems your family is dealing with now? Yeah, but not as bad. So these problems existed before you became a Marine, and they continued while you were away serving your country? I guess. Then how exactly is your sister's situation your fault? Rodriguez was quiet for a long time, struggling with a question that challenged his assumption of personal responsibility for circumstances beyond his control. But I'm supposed to be her big brother. I'm supposed to protect her. You are her big brother. But you're also a United States Marine serving your country hundreds of miles away from home. You can't be responsible for your family's problems and your military duties simultaneously. But if I'd handled the conversation better, then maybe your sister would have reacted differently, or maybe she would have run away anyway. Rodriguez, you can't control other people's choices. You can only control your own responses to their choices. Maria leaned forward, using the same tone she'd once used to counsel soldiers under her command, who were struggling with family problems during deployment. Here's what I know about family responsibility. You honor your family by being the best version of yourself you can be. You serve them by excelling at your military duties, by developing the skills and character that will let you help them more effectively when you're in a position to do so. But what if something happens to her while I'm here? Then you'll deal with that if and when it happens. But Rodriguez, destroying yourself with guilt over circumstances you can't control doesn't help your sister. It just ensures that when she does need you, you won't be in any condition to provide that help. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Maria gradually helping Rodriguez understand the difference between reasonable concern for his family and destructive guilt over their problems. She wasn't providing therapy, she was offering the perspective of someone who'd learned to distinguish between controllable and uncontrollable factors in crisis situations. By the time the chaplain arrived, Rodriguez was no longer talking about wanting to disappear. He was still struggling with his family situation, still carrying weight that was probably too heavy for someone his age, but he was no longer in immediate crisis. "Ma'am," he said as Maria prepared to leave, "thank you for talking to me. I feel like maybe I can get through this." Rodriguez, you're a Marine. Getting through impossible situations is literally part of your job description. You just needed someone to remind you that you're stronger than you think you are. As Maria walked back to the mess hall, Corporal Williams fell into step beside her. "Ma'am, what you did back there, that was leadership. Real leadership. I just talked to him." "You talked to him in a way that probably saved his life. And you did it without hesitation, without worrying about liability or authority, or whether it was technically your job." Williams was right, Maria realized. For the first time since walking out of Walter Reed, she'd encountered a crisis that required immediate leadership, and she'd responded without hesitation. She hadn't thought about her civilian status or her lack of official authority. She'd just seen a young Marine in trouble and done what needed to be done. "Williams, can I ask you something?" "Anything, ma'am." "Do you think I'm ready to be responsible for other people again?" Williams stopped walking and looked at her seriously. "Ma'am, with respect, you've been responsible for other people for months now. You've been helping me work through my guilt. Over Lance Corporal Davis, you've been preparing Lieutenant Chun for her deployment. You just talked PFC Rodriguez out of a crisis that could have ended his life. But that's different from accepting an official position where people's lives depend on my instruction." "Is it though?" "Because it seems to me like people's lives have been depending on your instruction all along. The only difference is whether you're willing to admit it." The observation hit Maria like a revelation. She'd been operating under the assumption that she was gradually working her way back toward being ready for responsibility, when in fact she'd been carrying responsibility all along. The difference wasn't her capability, it was her willingness to acknowledge and embrace that capability. Williams, what would you think if I told you I'd been offered a position as a civilian instructor with the Marine Corps? I'd think it was about time someone recognized what the rest of us have been seeing for months. And if I said I was considering turning it down because I wasn't sure I was ready, I'd say you were letting fear make decisions that should be made by wisdom. As they reached the mess hall, Maria realized that her conversation with PFC Rodriguez had answered the question she'd been wrestling with since General Williams's offer. She was ready not because she'd overcome her trauma or resolved all her guilt, but because she'd learned to carry that weight while still functioning as a leader. The question wasn't whether she was ready to accept responsibility again. The question was whether she was ready to stop pretending that she wasn't already carrying it. That evening, Maria made 2 phone calls that would define the next phase of her life. The first was to General Williams. "General, this is Maria Santos. I'd like to accept your offer. Outstanding. When can you start? I'll need 2 weeks to transition out of my current position and arrange housing if this job involves travel." "It does. We'll help with temporary lodging during travel assignments, and you'll have a permanent office here at Camp Pendleton as your home base. General, I have one condition." "What's that?" "I want to maintain some contact with the individual Marines and officers I've been working with informally, not as their official instructor, but as someone they can reach out to if they need guidance or support." "Agreed. In fact, I'd like you to continue that kind of mentoring as part of your official duties. We'll call it the Individual Development Program." "Thank you, ma'am." "Santos, welcome back to military service. I think you're going to find this experience very different from your previous military career." The second call was to Diego. "I took the job. I'm proud of you, Hermana." "Are you really?" "Santos, I've been watching you for the last few months, seeing you slowly remember who you are and what you're capable of. This job isn't about going back to who you were, it's about becoming who you're supposed to be next." "I'm scared." "Good. Fear means you're taking this seriously." "What if I can't handle it?" "Then you'll figure out how to handle it, just like you figured out how to handle everything else." Maria was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of her decision. "Diego, do you think Martinez, Johnson, Williams, and Crawford would approve of this choice?" "I think they'd be proud that their sacrifice contributed to your ability to help other soldiers come home alive." "How do you know?" "Because they were soldiers, which means they understood that the best way to honor fallen comrades is to use what their deaths taught you to save other people." After ending the call, Maria looked around her apartment one more time. Tomorrow she would begin the process of transitioning from Maria Santos, civilian contractor and invisible cleaning lady, to Maria Santos, civilian instructor in combat, leadership expert. It wouldn't be a return to her previous life. That person was gone, changed by trauma and loss and 2 years of hiding. But it would be a step forward into a life that honored both her experiences and her capabilities, that used her hard-won wisdom to serve something larger than her own comfort and safety. She looked at her purple heart tattoo, at the names of the soldiers who died under her command and the names of those who'd survived. For 2 years, she'd carried their memory as a burden. Now, for the first time, she was ready to carry it as a responsibility, not just to remember them, but to use what their sacrifice had taught her to help other people. Maria Santos was ready to stop hiding and start leading again. The realization felt like coming home to herself after a long journey through foreign territory. She wasn't the same person who'd walked out of Walter Reed 2 years ago, but she was finally ready to be whoever she was becoming next. And for the first time since the convoy ambush, that felt like enough. Thank you for joining us on Maria's incredible journey from isolation back to purpose. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, Share it with others who appreciate compelling military narratives. And subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the human cost of service and the power of redemption. Your support means everything to us.